Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to completely rethink how we evaluate technical documentation. For a long time, the industry has been hyper-focused on simple accuracy, just making sure every single comma and code snippet is technically perfect. But today, we're shifting our focus away from that raw, factual accuracy and moving toward a really exciting new paradigm: actual task success. We're going to look at why technically correct documentation can still be surprisingly awful, and more importantly, how we can finally fix it.
When we sit down to review a piece of technical writing, we almost always start with this deceptively simple question: is the information correct? Honestly, it's a supernatural starting point. We just kind of assume that if the facts are right, well, the documentation must be good, right? We assume correctness automatically equals quality. But as our source material from Content Craft Studio reveals, correctness is definitely essential, but correctness alone absolutely does not make documentation useful.
Section 1. The correctness illusion.
Let's dive right in and see why relying solely on technical correctness is actually a pretty dangerous illusion that totally sets users up for failure. Imagine an API endpoint where every single technical detail is laid out flawlessly. The endpoint URL? Spot on. The HTTP method is correct, every single parameter is defined perfectly, and the expected response structure is documented without a single error. By traditional standards, this documentation passes with flying colors. It is 100% technically accurate.
But here is the wild part. Despite that perfect technical accuracy, a developer trying to use it still completely fails to integrate the API. They're sitting there at their desk, staring at 100% correct information, fighting the urge to literally throw their laptop out the window, and they are completely stuck. This happens every single day in software development, and it really forces us to ask, why? Well, they fail because crucial usability elements are just missing. Perhaps the authentication requirements were documented somewhere entirely different and they can't find them. Maybe the developer doesn't know the proper sequence to actually call the endpoints. Or perhaps the example uses a value that is technically valid but totally unrealistic in a real-world scenario. They might even hit an undocumented error response. Or maybe the guide just assumes prerequisite knowledge the reader simply doesn't have. The document is correct, sure, but it's poorly structured and incredibly difficult to actually apply.
Section 2. Information versus experience.
This whole API failure highlights a massive distinction between the raw data we provide and the actual human being trying to make sense of it. Technical correctness is really just a property of the information itself. It just means the facts are accurate. But usability? That's a property of the user's actual experience in consuming and applying that information. Good technical communication has to tackle both. Information can totally be technically correct without being effectively communicated. Technical communication is what introduces structure and context around that raw information.
Section 3. Designing for task success.
To bridge this gap and create documentation that really works, we have to recognize that every piece of technical writing has a specific job to perform for the reader. We absolutely must shift away from system-centric documentation. System-centric writing just describes what a system does. It just lists facts. Instead, we need to move to task-centric communication, which explains what the user actually needs to do. Documentation exists within a task. An administrator doesn't just want to know what a setting is, they want to configure a system. A user wants to troubleshoot an error. A support team wants to resolve a recurring issue. Documentation only succeeds when it guides users through these specific goals with absolute confidence.
A professional technical communicator builds for this task success by thinking way beyond just writing sentences. They structure the content around audience, sequence, and navigation. Instead of just asking, what information do we have to share, they walk through a specific set of steps. First, identifying exactly who is reading. Then, defining your exact purpose and task. Establishing the right context and sequence so they don't get lost. And finally, ensuring the terminology matches what's actually in the product. It's all about knowing what the reader needs to know, exactly when they need to know it, and what they're supposed to do with it. Section 4. The bridge analogy. Our source material gives us a seriously powerful mental model for all of this, and it beautifully ties together everything we've been talking about regarding information versus experience. Just think of documentation as a vital bridge. On one side of this bridge, you have the product, the complex system, or the raw technical knowledge. On the far side, you have the person, the developer, the admin, the user, trying to use or understand it. The documentation is quite literally the only bridge connecting those two completely separate islands. And this brings us to a brilliant realization.
A technically correct bridge that does not reach the other side is still a failed bridge. It really doesn't matter if the engineering of the bridge is flawless. If it stops 10 feet short of the shoreline, the user is falling right into the water. Accurate but unusable documentation is exactly the same thing. It's a beautifully engineered structure that completely fails its core purpose.
Section 5, AI and editorial judgment.
This distinction between a correct bridge and a complete bridge is absolutely critical right now as we navigate the modern era of generative AI. Generative AI is undeniably powerful. Its strengths are just incredibly impressive. It's fantastic at producing fluent, authoritative language. It can reorganize massive amounts of data rapidly, and it's great at generating technically plausible examples on the fly. It can make an explanation sound incredibly authoritative and structurally sound.
However, we have to look really closely at its blind spots. AI systems often totally bomb at usability because they lack true lived context. They just don't understand the user's actual real-world task. They often don't know your specific organizational terminology or those sneaky undocumented dependencies that only your senior engineers know about. They lack an understanding of source authority, exceptions to the rules, and the broader business context. Basically, fluent language does not automatically mean useful technical communication.
Because of those blind spots, it all boils down to this. AI-assisted documentation absolutely still requires human editorial judgment. Correctness is just the foundational starting point. Professional documentation requires usability, findability, and clear structure. Human judgment remains the essential, totally irreplaceable ingredient to transform raw, fluent AI output into a highly usable communication system that actually guides a human being to success.
So as you evaluate your own systems, the real challenge is no longer, can AI write this documentation? The tech is already there for that. The true challenge is building a bridge that actually gets your user to the other side. So I want to leave you with this question. Can you give AI the right context, structure, and validation process to produce documentation that actually works?